The smell of paint thinner lingered in the air as I stared at the half-peeled wallpaper in my bedroom. The mess felt overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the mess in my head. I'd spent the better part of the day watching DIY tutorials, convinced I could handle this alone. But as usual, reality disagreed. "Mike," I called, my voice carrying through the quiet of the house. "Can you come here for a second? I need a hand." I heard the faint shuffle of his slippers against the hardwood floor before he appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, phone in hand, his thumb lazily scrolling. "What's up, kid?" he asked, with that casual smirk I'd grown up with. A smirk that usually meant he was amused at my expense. "I need help with this wall," I said, gesturing at the disaster before me. "I've already ruined one scraper, and if I ruin another, Mom's going to kill me." He laughed, stepping into the room. All right, don't panic. Let me take a look." But as he crossed the room toward me, something about his demeanor changed. His easygoing smirk softened into something else. Something I couldn't quite place. His eyes lingered on me longer than they should have. The air grew heavier, and for the first time in years, I felt uneasy around him. "Of course, I'll help you," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "But you'll owe me one." The words hung in the air, too light to seem threatening, yet heavy enough to send an uncomfortable shiver down my spine. I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "What do you mean, owe you? You live here too, you know. This mess is half yours." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with that strange expression, half amusement, half something else. "Don't worry about it. You'll find out." Something inside me tightened, a strange mix of unease and frustration. I told myself I was imagining things, that the awkward tension in the room was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something had shifted, and whatever it wasn't good. When Mike came into our lives 7 years ago, it was like a breath of fresh air for my mom. After years of struggling as a single parent, she deserved some happiness, and Mike delivered it in spades, or at least he seemed to. He was charming, dependable, and good with his hands, always fixing things around the house or cooking up elaborate meals to impress her. And for a while, I thought he was perfect too. He took me to school events when Mom was working late, remembered my favorite snacks, and even taught me how to ride a bike when I was younger. In many ways, he stepped into the fatherly role I'd been missing since I was a kid. But as I got older, things began to change. At first, it was subtle. His jokes about me getting prettier as I grew up. His compliments that lingered just a little too long. He'd tease me in ways that didn't feel entirely innocent, though I couldn't quite articulate why they made me uncomfortable. He'd call me princess or kiddo, but the warmth in those nicknames started to feel like it was masking something colder, something sharper. Mom didn't notice, or maybe she didn't want to notice. She was head over heels for Mike, and I couldn't blame her. He made her laugh like I'd never seen anyone else do, and she seemed younger around him, more carefree. Whenever I hinted at discomfort with some offhand comment he made, or the way his hand would linger on my shoulder, she brushed it off. "Oh, Emma, don't be so sensitive," she'd say with a wave of her hand. "Mike's just teasing. He loves you, you know." I wanted to believe her. But lately, Mike's teasing had turned into something different, something harder to ignore. His eyes would linger a little too long when I walked past in shorts or a tank top. If we were alone in a room, he'd stand too close, his presence filling the space until it felt like I couldn't breathe. And then there were the moments that couldn't be explained away by jokes or casual affection, like the time last summer when we were swimming in the backyard pool, and he suggested a game of chicken. It was just the three of us, Mom, Mike, and me. And I tried to laugh it off, but Mike insisted, saying it would be fun. "Come on, Emma," he said, his grin too wide. "I'll carry you, and your mom can be on her own team. Let's see who's stronger." Mom laughed, oblivious, and went along with it. I hesitated, but Mike was already moving toward me, his hands outstretched. Before I could protest, he grabbed me by the waist and hoisted me onto his shoulders, his grip firm and unyielding. It felt like a joke, until it didn't. His hands slid just a fraction lower than they needed to, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that made my stomach twist. I froze, too stunned to say anything, and the game went on as if nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling of his touch, or the way he'd grinned up at me, like he knew exactly what he was doing. That was the first time I felt truly unsafe around him. Since then, I'd tried to keep my distance, finding excuses to avoid being alone with him. But Mike was persistent, always finding reasons to linger in my space. He'd show up in my room under the guise of fixing something, his eyes scanning the space in a way that made my skin crawl. "Just checking in, princess," he'd say with that same smirk, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. And then there was the night a few weeks ago when Mom went out with her friends, leaving me and Mike alone for the evening. I'd planned to spend the night in my room, pretending to do homework while actually scrolling through TikTok. But halfway through the evening, Mike knocked on my door and invited himself in, holding 2 glasses of wine. "Don't tell your mom," he said with a wink, handing me a glass. "A little sip won't hurt." He wanted to say no, but the way he was looking at me made it hard to refuse. His eyes had that same strange intensity, the one that made me feel like a deer caught in headlights. I took the glass and set it on my desk, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. Instead, he sat on the edge of my bed and started talking. About work, about Mom, about how grown up I was becoming. "You're really turning into a beautiful young woman, Emma," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Ah, thanks," I muttered, not meeting his eyes. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know, sometimes I think you understand me better than your mom does." The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I mumbled something about needing to finish my homework and practically shoved him out of the room, locking the door behind him. I didn't tell Mom. How could I? She'd never believe me. Or worse, she'd believe me but wouldn't do anything about it. So I kept quiet. But now, standing in my room with Mike grinning at me in that way that made my stomach churn, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening, whatever Mike thought he was doing, it wasn't going to stop on its own. I just didn't know what to do about it. The light outside was fading, casting long shadows across my room. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house. Mom leaving for her book club. It was just me and Mike now, and I could feel the weight of his presence, even though he was in another part of the house. I tried to focus on the half-finished wall in front of me, the scraper trembling in my hand. My mind was racing. Was I imagining things? Was I overreacting? Mom always said Mike loved me like his own daughter, but the way he looked at me, the things he said, daughters weren't supposed to feel this way around their dad. "Need a hand, princess?" His voice startled me. I spun around to find him standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. He was holding a toolbox, his smirk firmly in place. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "I've got it under control." Stepped into the room anyway, setting the toolbox on the floor. "Come on, you know you don't have to do everything by yourself." He swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way my heart was pounding. "Really, it's okay. You don't have to." But he was already beside me, reaching for the scraper in my hand. His fingers brushed mine as he took it, lingering just a second too long. I flinched, stepping back. "You're so tense," he said, his voice softer now. "Relax, I'm just trying to help." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. For a few minutes he worked in silence, peeling away the stubborn strips of wallpaper. I hovered near the door, watching him carefully. He seemed normal. Maybe I was overthinking everything. "Emma," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Yeah?" He set down the scraper and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Can I ask you something?" I froze. "Sure," I said cautiously. He stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away until my back hit the wall. He was too close now, His eyes locked on mine. "You were growing up so fast," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes I wonder if your mom even notices." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. "I mean, you're not a little girl anymore. You're different now. More mature." He felt like I couldn't breathe. "Mike, what are you talking about?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, princess. You know what I'm talking about." "No, I don't," I said, my voice shaking. He sighed, leaning against the wall beside me. "You don't have to pretend, Emma. I've seen the way you look at me, the way you blush when I'm around." I stared at him, horrified. "What are you talking about?" "I don't. It's okay," he said, cutting me off. "You don't have to be embarrassed. It's natural, to feel things for someone you're close to." His words sent a wave of nausea through me. I tried to move, but he blocked my path, his hand resting on the wall beside me. "Mike, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, studying me. "Why are you so scared, princess? I'm not going to hurt you." He wanted to scream, to shove him away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, trapped between him and the wall. "Please," I said, my voice breaking, "just go." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he stepped back, giving me just enough space to slip past him. I ran to my room, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor as tears streamed down my face. What was I supposed to do? Tell Mom? She wouldn't believe me. Confront Mike? That felt impossible. I grabbed my phone and opened the chat with my best friend, Megan. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't know what to say. How could I put this into words? How could I explain what had just happened? Finally, I typed, "Can we talk?" She responded almost immediately. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, then typed, "It's Mike. He said something weird." There was a pause before her reply came through. "Weird how? What did he say?" I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. I couldn't bring myself to tell her everything. Not yet. I don't know. "I think I'm just overthinking it. Never mind. Emma, if something's wrong, you can tell me. I'm here, okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thanks. I'll talk to you later." I put my phone down and curled up on my bed, pulling the blanket over me. My mind was racing, replaying the conversation with Mike over and over again. He hadn't touched me, not really. He hadn't said anything explicitly threatening, but the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it felt like a line had been crossed, even if I couldn't explain how. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. The days that followed were a blur of unease and paranoia. Mike's words haunted me, looping endlessly in my head. I couldn't shake the way his voice had softened, how close he had been, or the intensity in his eyes when he'd said, "I've seen the way you look at me." He tried to avoid him as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. He was always around, popping up in the kitchen when I grabbed a snack, lingering in the living room when I walked through. It felt deliberate, like he was trying to remind me of his presence, to make sure I didn't forget what he'd said. Mom, of course, didn't notice. She was busier than ever, staying late at work and spending her evenings engrossed in her book club or yoga classes. Part of me wanted to tell her, to finally get it all out, but every time I tried to imagine the conversation, my stomach turned. What if she didn't believe me? Worse, what if she believed me but decided to stay with him anyway? One evening, as I was scrolling through TikTok in my room, I heard a knock at the door. "Emma?" It was Mike. I froze, my heart pounding. "What?" The door creaked open slightly, and he poked his head in, smiling. "Hey, can I come in?" "No," I said quickly, sitting up. I'm busy. He ignored me, pushing the door open and stepping inside. He had a plate in his hands with 2 cookies on it. I thought you might want a snack, he said, setting the plate on my desk. You've been in here all day. Thought you could use a break. I stared at the cookies, my hands clenched into fists. Thanks, I muttered, hoping he'd leave. But he didn't. He sat on the edge of my bed, his smile fading into something softer, more serious. You've been avoiding me, he said. I looked away, pretending to be engrossed in my phone. I'm not avoiding you. I've just been busy, Emma. His voice was low, almost gentle. You don't have to be scared of me. I turned to him, my throat tight. I'm not scared of you. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then why won't you talk to me? Why won't you even look at me? Because you're making me uncomfortable. I blurted out, my voice trembling. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry if I've made you feel that way, he said. That's the last thing I want. I didn't respond, my chest heaving as I tried to keep my emotions in check. You're important to me, Emma, he continued, his voice soft. Mike, stop, I said, my voice cracking. He reached out as if to touch my hand, but I pulled away, standing up. You need to go, I said, my back pressed against the wall. Emma, go, he hesitated, his expression a mix of frustration and something else, something darker. Then he stood up, walking to the door. Before he left, he turned back to me, his eyes lingering on mine. Her family, Emma? He said quietly. You can't avoid me forever. The door closed behind him, and I collapsed onto my bed, tears streaming down my face. The next morning, I decided I couldn't handle it alone anymore. I needed to tell someone. Megan was the only person I trusted. I texted her during lunch, asking if we could meet up after school. She agreed immediately, sensing the urgency in my message. When the final bell rang, I grabbed my things and headed to the park where we always hung out. Megan was already there, sitting on our usual bench with a concerned look on her face. What's going on? She asked as I sat down beside her. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. It's Mike, I said. Her eyes widened. What about him? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. He's been acting weird, saying things that aren't okay. Like what? I looked down at my hands, twisting them in my lap. He said he thinks I have feelings for him. And he keeps looking at me, touching me. My voice broke, and I felt tears prick my eyes. Megan's face darkened. That's disgusting, she said. Have you told your mom? No? I said quickly. She won't believe me. She loves him. Megan grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. You have to tell someone, Emma. This isn't okay. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But what if it makes everything worse? What if he gets mad? Or what if Mom doesn't believe me and takes his side? She won't, Megan said firmly. And if she does, then she doesn't deserve to have you in her life. Her words gave me a flicker of hope, but the fear still lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what Megan had said. She was right. Mike's behavior wasn't okay, and I couldn't keep pretending it was. But the thought of confronting him, or even telling Mom, filled me with dread. I was startled out of my thoughts by the sound of my door creaking open. I sat up, my heart racing, as Mike stepped into the room. Mike, what are you doing? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. He closed the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. I just wanted to check on you, he said, his voice low. You seemed upset earlier. I'm fine, I said quickly. You don't need to check on me. Yeah, took a step closer, and I instinctively pulled the blanket up to my chest. Emma, he said, his tone almost pleading. I know you're scared, but you don't have to be. I would never hurt you. You already are, I said, my voice shaking. His expression darkened for a moment before softening again. I don't want you to think of me as the bad guy, he said. I feel close to you. Closer than I've ever felt to anyone. You're my stepdad, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, he said, but I can't help how I feel. Tears welled up in my eyes and I shook my head. You need to leave, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping. Okay, he said quietly, but we need to talk about this, Emma. You can't keep shutting me out. He left the room, and I burst into tears, my whole body trembling. Something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. But I didn't know if I had the strength to make it happen. The house was too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the edge of my coffee mug with trembling fingers, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. Mom had left for an overnight conference, leaving me alone with Mike. It was a scenario I had dreaded for weeks, and now it was here. The hours dragged by. I avoided him as much as I could, retreating to my room after dinner and locking the door. But even with the lock, I didn't feel safe. I sat on my bed, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, every sound in the house making me jump. And then I heard it. The creak of footsteps outside my door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The handle jiggled. Once, twice, Emma. His voice was low, almost soft. Are you awake? My heart raced. I stayed silent, hoping he'd go away. But he didn't. I know you're in there, he said, his tone shifting slightly. We need to talk. No, we don't, I said, my voice shaking. Yes, we do, he insisted. I can't stand this anymore. This distance between us. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Open the door, Emma. There was a pause, and then his voice came again, quieter. There was a pause, and then his voice came again, quiet. If you don't open it, I'm coming in. I scrambled off the bed, my mind racing. My phone was on the nightstand. Should I call Mom? Megan? The police? Before I could decide, the door burst open. The lock splintered as it gave way, and Mike stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. Mike, what the hell? I yelled, backing away. I'm sorry, he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. But you're not giving me a choice. He grabbed my phone, holding it up like a shield. Get out! He ignored me, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. I didn't want it to come to this, Emma. But you've been pushing me away, and I can't take it anymore. Take what? I said, my voice rising. What the hell are you talking about? His expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost hurt. I care about you, he said. More than you realize. More than I should. I stared at him, my stomach churning. You're my stepdad, I said, the words sharp and angry. I know, he said, taking a step closer. And I've tried to fight it, Emma. Believe me, I have. But I can't help how I feel. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. This is wrong, Mike. You know it is. Is it? He said, his voice low and intense. You're not a little girl anymore. You're smart and beautiful. And stop, I yelled, cutting him off. Just stop. But he kept coming, his eyes locked on mine. You don't have to be scared, he said. I would never hurt you. I just want you to understand how much you mean to me. I backed up until I hit the wall, my phone still clutched in my hand. Get Out, I said, my voice trembling. He reached out, his hand brushing my arm. Emma, please, he said. Just listen. I said, get out, I screamed, shoving him away with all my strength. He stumbled back, his expression flickering between shock and anger. For a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening. Fine, he said, his voice cold. If that's how you want it. He turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. I sat on the floor, my whole body trembling. My phone was still in my hand, and I stared at it for a long moment before unlocking it and calling Megan. She picked up on the second ring. Emma, I said, my voice breaking. I said, my voice breaking. He came into my room. What? She said, her voice sharp. Are you safe? Where is he now? He left, I said, trying to catch my breath. But I don't know what to do. I'm so scared, Megan. You need to call your mom, she said firmly. You need to call your mom, she said. Tell her everything. I can't, I said, shaking my head, even though she couldn't see me. She won't believe me. She has to, Megan said. And if she doesn't, we'll figure something out. But you can stay there alone with him. Her words settled something inside me. I couldn't keep hiding this. If I didn't say something now, it would only get worse. The next morning, Mom came home earlier than expected. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched plate of toast in front of me, when she walked in. Emma? She said, her voice cheerful. Why are you up so early? I looked up at her, my chest tightening. Mom, we need to talk. She frowned, setting her bag down on the counter. What's wrong? It's Mike, I said, my voice trembling. Her expression shifted to concern. What about him? I took a deep breath. My hands clenched into fists. He's been acting weird, saying things, coming into my room when I tell him not to. She stared at me, her brow furrowing. What kind of things? I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. But then I thought of Megan, of how scared I'd been last night. I couldn't stay silent anymore. He said he has feelings for me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she shook her head, laughing nervously. Emma, that's ridiculous. Mike loves you like a daughter. He would never... I'm not lying, I said, my voice rising. He told me. He came into my room last night and said he couldn't take the distance between us. Her face went pale. What? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. He said he's tried to fight it, but he can't. Mom, I'm scared. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. He's been so good to us. He would never... He did, I said, cutting her off. And if you don't believe me, then I'll leave. I'll go stay with Megan, but I can't stay here with him. She looked at me, her eyes filled with pain and confusion. Then she stood up, her jaw tightening. Where is he now? She asked. In the garage, I said. Without another word, she walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the house. I sat there, my heart pounding, as I listened to the muffled sound of their voices in the garage. There was yelling, and then silence. When Mom came back, her face was hard, her eyes red. He's leaving, she said. Pack your things. We're staying at a hotel for a few days. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with sadness. Our family was broken, and nothing would ever be the same. The drive to the hotel was silent. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the streetlights blurred into streaks of gold against the dark sky. Mom gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to comfort her. But the words wouldn't come. The events of the past few hours replayed in my mind like a bad dream. The confrontation in the garage had been explosive, their voices rising to a crescendo that rattled the walls. I hadn't been able to make out all the words, but I'd heard enough to know that Mom believed me, or at least she couldn't ignore what I told her. "He's gone," she said now, breaking the silence. Her voice was tight, brittle, as though it might shatter at any moment. "Where did he go?" I asked quietly. "I don't care," she said, her jaw clenched. "He packed a bag and left. That's all that matters." He nodded, though it didn't feel like enough. The tension in the car was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. When we arrived at the hotel, Mom checked us in while I waited by the lobby's glass doors, staring at my reflection. I looked pale, my eyes rimmed with red. I barely recognized myself. The room was small but clean, with 2 twin beds and a TV mounted on the wall. Mom set her bag down on the nearest bed and sank into the mattress, burying her face in her hands. "Mom," I said softly, sitting beside her. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I hesitated, guilt twisting in my stomach. "I didn't think you'd believe me," I admitted. Her face crumpled, and she pulled me into a hug. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she whispered. "I should have noticed. I should have protected you." I held onto her tightly, the warmth of her embrace soothing the ache in my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. The next few days passed in a haze. Mom called into work and spent hours on the phone with lawyers and therapists, trying to figure out what to do next. She didn't want to go back to the house, and I didn't blame her. I spent most of my time talking to Megan, who had been a lifeline through it all. She wanted to come over, but I wasn't ready to see anyone in person. The thought of explaining everything made my stomach churn. On the 3rd day, Mom sat me down at the little hotel table, her expression serious. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what's next." "Okay," I said cautiously. "I want us to move," she said. "I know it's sudden, but I can't stay in that house, and I don't want you anywhere near him." I nodded slowly. "Where would we go?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I'll figure it out. I just want us to have a fresh start." A fresh start. The words sounded good, hopeful, even, but they didn't erase the weight of what had happened. Still, I knew she was right. Staying here wasn't an option. A month later, we were living in a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Mom had hired a moving company to pack up the house, and we never went back. I started at a new school, where no one knew what had happened. It was a chance to reinvent myself, to leave the past behind. But the shadows of what Mike had done followed me everywhere. Therapy helped. Mom and I both started seeing a counselor, and while the sessions were hard, they gave me a space to unpack everything I'd been carrying. Mom tried her best to make up for what had happened, but I could see the guilt weighing on her. She threw herself into being present, cooking dinner every night, taking me shopping, asking about my day. It was almost too much, but I understood why she was doing it. "For being brave," she said. "For telling me the truth, even when it was hard. You've been through so much, and you're still standing." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I leaned against her shoulder. I'd hear Mike's voice in my head, or feel his presence in the room, even though I knew he wasn't there. But as time passed, the memories began to lose their power. The wounds he'd left started to heal, little by little. I focused on rebuilding my life, making new friends, diving into my schoolwork, and finding joy in the small things. I even joined the art club, something I'd always wanted to do but had been too scared to try. And through it all, Mom was there, cheering me on. 2 years later, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cap and gown I'd just put on. My high school graduation. It felt like a milestone I hadn't been sure I'd reach, back when everything had fallen apart. "Ready?" Mom asked, stepping into the room. I turned to her, smiling. "Yeah." She hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I let myself soak in the happiness of the moment. As we walked out the door, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Mike was gone, out of our lives for good. And while the scars he'd left would never completely fade, They no longer defined me. I was stronger now. We were stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.